Okay, guys, so I just met all of you shortly ago, and hopefully now you are moving on to the lecture portion where I sort of record here and you guys listen to sort of the content on your own time whenever you have time to do that. So really, I want to talk about the waves of feminism and what we're really going to be looking at this semester. Each week we'll sort of focus on a different wave of feminism and sort of move our way chronologically through them. So next week, we'll really I think like 4 weeks from now, technically, which is crazy, because of Labor Day, we'll be starting the first wave of feminism, which is in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is really the time period in which we have women working for the right to vote. So we have the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 with Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Blackwell, Jane Addams, Dorothy Day, and overturning sort of legal inequalities. So women gaining the right to vote, and most artists of this time period are sort of called proto-feminists, which is interesting, and we'll kind of talk about artists being called feminists versus not feminists and what even any of that means. But it'll be really interesting to look at some of the core of feminism in sort of the early 1900s, late 1800s, to see sort of how we get to women's suffrage and sort of talk about these first movements towards feminism. So the second wave of feminism then comes, and this is usually the period that most people know and are most familiar with, which is from the 60s to the 80s. And it really occurs because of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And she publishes this, which she interviews some number of people who she went to school with in the past and realizes that so many women are unhappy with their lives, and it sort of prompts her to start interviewing different sort of quote-unquote suburban housewives of the 1950s and to put out this massive book about how all of these women are actually really unhappy in their lives, and all of them have been living thinking that they were the only ones. So it's this crazy challenge to the construct of sort of male versus female in the 50s, and then sort of bursts into the second wave of feminism. So we have slogans like the personal is political, where people start looking inward and wanting to change their lives within the larger complex of oppression. So, like I said, Betty Friedan looking at housewives and this sort of idea that advertising and the government and all these different sort of corporations have sort of strung up to get women back in the house again. And we'll talk about all these things. But so that sort of spurs this second wave of feminism. So, like I said, turning inwards, trying to redefine how they view themselves, the everyday, the domestic, and the specifically embodied. Women's struggle is a class struggle, looking not just at white women, but women of all colors. So this sort of starts to take off in the second wave of feminism. So artists like this include Jenny Holzer, Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, Barbara Kruger, Carolee Schneemann, Hannah Wilk, and Yayoi Kusama. Now, the third wave is really sort of started by the Riot Girls, and we're going to talk about them when we get to the third wave of feminism. But a lot of it is marked by post-colonial and postmodern thinking and sort of rejecting the concept inherently of feminist, destabilizing outdated constructs of sexuality, of gender, the body, and heteronormativity, and the development of individual identity. So we'll see artists like Cindy Sherman, Joyce Wieland, Lilith Adler. So really sort of constructing and deconstructing feminism in a lot of ways to rethink what it really means to be a feminist in this sort of day and age. So really at the beginning of the 90s with groups like the Riot Girl that moves into the 2000s. Now, a lot of people sort of battle with whether or not we're currently in the fourth wave of feminism, and we probably won't identify strictly like what wave we're in until it's over, because you don't name something until it's over in art history for whatever reason, unless you're Impressionism or a lot of the modernist movements. But most of the time, scholars usually name it much later. So people who believe in sort of the fourth wave of feminism, which we will focus on in this class, focus on issues like sexual abuse, rape, violence against women, unequal pay, slut shaming, and the pressure of women to conform to one body type. And this is a call for all gender equality. So not just females, but you start talking about transgender males and females, etc. So all inclusive, all races, all genders, all of these things should have equality. And if those things weren't stated previously, they're trying to sort of build up to that in a lot of ways. So here are some artists that we'll be talking about from the fourth wave of feminism, as again, like I said. So, however, how do we continue to define feminism today and to think about it critically? And how does it change based on time or race or religion? And what you will find sort of historically is that there is the exclusion of Black women and women of other than white, middle class, upper class women. Middle and upper class women are excluded from feminism. So in the early 1900s, even though women are fighting for the right to vote, it's not including Black women. So you have to always consider that a lot of these movements are part of their time, in that they're not considering all women to be equal. And so as we move through the waves of feminism, you'll see the more inclusion of women of all races, which of course is how it always should be. But it's sort of not thought about in that way in the 1920s, which is disheartening but true. So when we look at this class and think about this class, I'll make sure to engage a lot of these different things, because what we need to know is who is actually included in this idea of equality, right? Quote unquote equality. So we'll talk about other terms like proto and post-feminism, as well as intersexual feminism, post-colonial feminism, as well as Black feminism. So making sure that women of other races, that transgender individuals, that all of these people have an equal conversation in the fight for equality. Whoops. So I've seen this cartoon a bit, and sorry, it's a little pixelated, but all feminists are equal, but some feminists are more equal than others. So the same sort of construct. And you have to think that this is sort of a larger issue as well. White, heteronormative, wealthy women were allowed to vote, whereas other people were sort of marginalized and treated like they didn't matter or weren't as important, like Black women, like lesbian women, etc. So there are a lot of constructs around feminism versus anti-feminism, and this draws a lot, I would say, like within the time of social media, and etc., that there's become even more of a conversation about feminist versus anti-feminist. But you can see sort of in the past, these are some weird like little clips from like People magazine or something, where you have a couple of celebrities saying that they are anti-feminist or not a feminist. So Carrie Underwood, I wouldn't say I am a feminist. That comes with a negative connotation. Shailene Woodley says, wow, I even have her name right there and I spelled it wrong. Shailene Woodley, the word feminist is the word that discriminates, and I'm not into that. Kelly Clarkson, when people hear feminist, it's like, get out of my way, I don't need anyone. Which doesn't sound like a negative critique somehow, but regardless. And then you have people like Jerry Hollowell, who say, for me, feminism is bra-burning lesbianism. It's very unglamorous. She was Ginger Spice, I believe, from the Spice Girls. So you can see that to some extent there has been these sort of negative connotations about feminism, and what feminism really is. But when you get down to the core of it, today, feminism is considered more popular and accepted. And all feminism really is at its core is about the equality of sexes. And if you're not for that, what are you for? So when you look at some of these movements, you can definitely see what people think, and what they say, and you can have sort of develop your own opinion. I have included some quotes from different famous female celebrities that you can definitely read and look at, that I've included here. I think it's also important for us to look at Lemonade by Beyonce. It has a very particular, important set of feminist ideals that she includes in her 2016 album. She says, I put the definition of feminist in my song and on my tour, not for propaganda or to proclaim to the world that I'm a feminist. But to give clarity to the true meaning, a feminist is someone who believes in equal rights for men and women. I don't understand the negative connotation of the word or why it should exclude the opposite sex. If you are a man who believes your daughter should have the same opportunities and rights as your son, then you're a feminist. According to other scholars who have watched and sort of read into some of her work on Lemonade, I believe wholeheartedly that Beyonce made this album for Black women, for all of us that are expected to deal with our open wounds quietly while society keeps ripping them open again and again by killing our sons, raping our daughters, making us invisible. Beyonce with this album doesn't just say, I see you, she says, I am you. So I want you to watch this Beyonce music video, Flawless. I'm sure that will be a real struggle for all of you. I've included the link here and I will put that again on the Moodle. But at the minute 24 seconds, I have it down at the bottom, you have this quote about feminism. And I've listed it here as well. Oh, sorry, this was just a cool font I found from the song Flawless. But it includes this text by Adichie in which she talks about women, and she's this very important and interesting Nigerian scholar. I will include her TED Talk on the Moodle as well. It's definitely something that you should watch and has become very popular since Beyonce has included this quote in her song as well. But go take a look at Flawless, go pause me and watch a music video. I know that'll be really rough for you guys. Other than Beyonce, hopefully now that you are back, there are other groups like the He for She movement, which has gained popularity, and this group supported by Emma Watson and her conversations on He for She. So I have included her UN speech from September 2014, where she talks a lot about the idea of feminism. If you stand for equality, then you're a feminist. Sorry to tell you, which is hilarious. And then we get into sort of these opposite ideas, right? What are anti-feminist? What are these ideas? Kathy Long wrote an article in September 2014 critiquing her speech, and she said different things such as, but unfortunately, feminism in its present form has too often ignored sexist biases against males and sometimes has actively contributed to them. Until that changes, the movement for gender equality will be incomplete. So some of these anti-feminist movements really dwell on the idea that what women really want when they say feminism is for women to be more important or more valuable than men, which is of course not the case. So these are women who want to reclaim feminism in some negative way, to say that if you're a feminist, then you don't believe in equality. And so you can sort of read and look at these things. I have Women Against Feminism and their website here. Believe that feminism promotes misandry, which is the hatred of men, and that women are not oppressed in the 21st century. Feminism promotes women as victims, and they prefer to subscribe to the concept of humanism. So there are a lot of different ways you can think about anti-feminism and people who claim to be anti-feminists. But you can sort of look at the different things out there on Twitter or on social media as well. And women have also fought back with a hashtag on Twitter that is a parody of Women Against Feminism. That's Woman Against Feminism, which says things like, I don't need feminism because I like doing housework. In fact, vacuuming is the only thing that drowns out the shrieking voice coming from in me. Or I don't need feminism, spelled ridiculously, because I love men and feminists hate men. Even if married one, it's an elaborate centuries-long undercover operation, etc. So what you'll find is that sort of, and this is probably even popular today, shockingly enough, but you still have this sort of anti-feminist idea, even though at its core, it doesn't really make any sense to be anti-feminist as you believe in equality, right? The same thing as, in my personal opinion, Black Lives Matter, as we should always support Black lives and lives in general, and them being treated not as such is ridiculous. And trying to do like all lives matter, it really doesn't make sense, right? This is the same thing as saying feminism will run about men, right? So this has sort of become a problem and a construct, and it sort of becomes complicated because when you have women that are oppressed for so long and treated for so long, and then men come back and say angrily sort of, well, what about us? And what about these things? It's kind of ridiculous. It kind of feels offensive because when I say women are oppressed and I say men are doing the oppressing, I don't mean all men and I don't mean singular men, right? I'm not calling out singular men. I'm not saying men are not raped and are not sexually assaulted, but you have to also realize sort of the dichotomy that lies between the oppression of women historically and what that sort of means for women as a group today. So of course I stumbled into some long and angry, vile fall apart of my lecture at 11 p.m. on Sunday, the day before classes start, which is that I own this book and it's called Men and Owner's Manual, and I think I got it out of like a free library or something, which is really a joke. It's a satire by Stephanie Brush about how to own men, right? Which is a joke. It's not supposed to be a real thing. And of course, what I stumbled upon was this. So I stumble upon for some godforsaken reason, this comment on Amazon, where I have, I read this figure, Anthony Sinnott, who talks about how ridiculously stupid and sexist this book is against men. And so I end up in this deep dive, right? I don't know if you guys ever do this, but I do it all the time, where I start looking at Anthony Sinnott and what he does, and this is a description of one of his books, which is called Rethinking Men, Heroes, Villains, and Victims, where it states in the Amazon description, much writing on men in the field of gender studies tends to focus unduly, almost exclusively, on portraying men as villains and women as victims in a moral bipolar paradigm. Rethinking Men reverses that proclivity, which ignores not only the positive contributions of men to society, but also the male victims of life, including the homeless, the incarcerated, the victims of homicide, suicide, accidents, war in the draft, and sexism, as well as those affected by failures of health, education, etc. And so he focuses on 3 different men types: heroes, villains, and victims, and breaks down the idea of male masculinity and how it is deteriorated. So, of course, I stumbled upon an article called 50 Shades of Men, which is a tragically titled article. It's awful, but really breaks down sort of the problems with feminism, right? Where men have this issue in not being able to pick out male role models. They want to only pick out Superman or Batman because they really don't see public figures as heroes anymore. He says the advent of birth control pill and the women's movement were crucial to refashioning gender roles. The women's movement transformed our world for the better, but there has been a cost, such as plummeting birth and rising divorce rates across Canada. Roles continue to alter as much more women enter the workforce and earn their own money. Until the women's movement, men had been the main providers for their families. In times of war, men were and continue to be primary protectors of their countries. Men had also been rulers in politics and economics, despite universal suffrage in Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom. So, apparently, women getting freedoms causes plummeting birth of children and rising divorce rates, which is inherently tragic for men. And then unemployed men turn to social deviance, substance abuse, public brawls. Historically, the biggest riots have always been led by disaffected men who feel emasculated. Oh, and this is his picture for 50 Shades of Men. Ooh. And I read another article which broke down even more of his theories, and I was just like horrified. Rethinking his theory. And so you can sort of look at some of these things. I'm not going to read all of them. But basically, that has caused sort of this, feminism has sort of called this reverse problem, which is that men lose their masculinity and now they're demasculated, and now men have sort of a large problem, not feeling confident or strong. And so now we have new misandry instead of feminism. So it's really crazy to kind of look at these things and to see how he picks apart different feminist figures and saying that this causes women to be viewed as angels and men to be filled as demons. And then it says, nevertheless, certain passages apparently can still ruffle feathers, such as those criticizing feminist failure to recognize how patriarchy has, especially in democracies, contributed substantially to women's empowerment and liberation. Of that passage, Dr. Sanat recounts, one woman said, so we should be grateful to be liberated by men? And I said, no, we're just trying to set the historical record straight. It was men who had the power, and it was men who took the decisions, and it wasn't Gloria Steinem. He also writes, men in patriarchy have not clung to power, but have democratically, wow, I didn't read that word at all, share power, transfer power, even at some cost to themselves. But does he think any transfer would have occurred had women like Gloria Steinem not spoken up? No, probably not. Not so quickly, but that wasn't really the point. I'm trying to think about this in terms of history rather than in terms of ideology. So he's saying men are the real feminists because they're the ones who actually gave their power over to the women because they asked for it. And beauty competitions do not kill men. Wars kill men. Some might find such comparisons trivialized and oversimplify women's issues, not to mention the fact that wars kill women too. Addressing the latter point, Dr. Sanat writes, certainly women have been, and still are, massively victimized by war, but usually as civilians rather than combatants. Recalling the 6-year Vietnam War, he underlines that 8 U.S. service women were killed and over 58,000 men, and draws a conclusion that this does indicate that women have a privileged status in war, whether or not they want it, which was definitely because women have decided not to fight historically in wars and not because they were cut out of the military. So, the issues that I have with this sort of dialogue, right, is that you start sort of, it's kind of mansplaining in that it tells women why they were oppressed and why their oppression is now lifted by the good graces of men, but has now caused great problems for men, which is really not an actual problem. What I do find instead is that the same sort of ideological gender performances that carry on in women, that women have to be feminine and petite and always look a particular way and wear makeup and have long hair, is just as equally negative to women as some of these masculine ideas are to men. So telling boys they can't cry, that they can't think about their emotions, that men have to do certain things and women have to do certain things. Both of those things are equally as negative towards males and females. The same idea goes for people not believing men can be raped or sexually assaulted, which is ridiculous. So there were these 2 films set out by the same film group, Misrepresentation and The Mask You Live In, which focus on male and female sort of issues with these ideas of femininity and masculinity that are inherently toxic to who people are as individuals. So we're going to really think about a lot of these ideas, and I know I threw a lot at you. But just think about how complicated these things are, and when some angry white man comes at you telling you that you've made his masculinity suffer, maybe you'll think about it again. So think about these ideas as we move into reading Linda Nochlin and talking about individuals. And I, of course, am not anti-man or anti-woman in any capacity, but I am anti-oppression and I am anti sort of gender normatives about who people are and what they should be based on their gender or sexuality. So we're going to talk about all these things. I hope you enjoy reading Linda Nochlin, and we'll talk about her next week.